This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and occasionally lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plem.
We've got it is deep into December now. We had our first snow over, I guess, on Friday. I was about to say over the weekend. So we are staying on brand and on theme with a couple of holiday wintry style questions this week. Starting with our question of the episode, which is your winter break book of choice, as distinct from summer reading. Not the same thing at all. Very, very different. Erin, what is your selection?
So I do like kind of a moody, cozy winter read. I will say that I just finished rereading Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy for no particular reason. We're not quite on winter break yet, but like that, maybe that was like my Thanksgiving weekend read. So like I like something that's a little bit dense, but also a little bit familiar. I like the Green Glass House books, Lauren, which I know that you like. Like those are quite festive and also seem, winter sort of oriented. So, I think I like a mystery, or something, sometimes maybe a thriller, like even a spy novel thriller, which I wouldn't ordinarily read because I would stay up all night finishing it. And that's not a good idea during normal times, but is maybe okay during winter break.
Rada, what about you?
Mine are much less deep, as always. I really enjoy the book version of Hallmark movies for the holidays. So, for instance, I have recently completed the book Good Spirits, in which a spirit is sent to haunt people in the 2 weeks before Christmas to help them find their true loves. Just leave that mysterious direction of the book. I also really enjoyed In a Holidaze, spelled D-A-Z-E, in which a woman is forced to relive the same day over and over again of her family reunion at their cabin, or like a family gathering at a cabin. So this is what I last year really much enjoyed, the book Icebreaker. So these are the it was hockey themed. So when I described it as skating, and that made it confusing to people because apparently ice hockey and skating are totally different things. But yes, I enjoy a holiday themed, fluffy, frothy romance book that I can read while having a delicious beverage, maybe too much sugar, not use my brain very much, and feel frothy and light myself.
All right. So, Erin, you mentioned Green Glass House, which I definitely love as holiday reads. I've already completed my annual Ghost of Green Glass House reading. When I was more in the teenager to college era, I used to read a book called A Bird's Christmas Carol every year. It's a pretty short novella. It's by Kate Douglas Wiggin, who wrote Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. People may remember this. It is really, really cheesy, but like just kind of fits in that vibe. And then I recently started trying to read A Christmas Carol once a year. And it's just great. Like, not all Charles Dickens books are great. Some of them are just like, dude, you clearly got paid by the page. But A Christmas Carol is phenomenal. Highly, highly recommend it as a read. And then I try to pick a more kind of dark Erin style book, as you were talking about earlier. And I think this year I'm going to reread Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, which really enjoy. Love that book. I haven't read it in a few years, so it'll have some surprises for me.
Very interesting choice.
Yeah. Well, as we move into holiday party season in the DC area, there will be lots of things going on in the cocktail hours. Lots of people trying to figure out, when they say cocktail dress for these holiday parties, do they really mean it, or can I just get away with wearing what I wore to work? And as they gather together, they'll all be discussing all of the hot topics. Let's be real, they're probably not going to discuss the ones that Rada and I are raising here, even unless they are like really, really nerdy. There definitely is one that Erin is going to raise. So I'll start just to get my nerdiness out of the way, because I was attracted to this for a few reasons. One, it's a backronym. I love backronyms. And two, I actually think it's a really important issue, and that is the IRS Math Act And actually, I thought I was going to remember what math stood for, but now I can't. So MATH, acronym of choice. This was a recent bipartisan bill that passed with Senator Elizabeth Warren as one of the main leads, but she was not there was a number of bipartisan support for it. And what I love about this is it now requires the IRS to provide taxpayers with clear notice and a fair shot around when they did something wrong on their taxes. So if you've ever had a problem with your taxes before, you may recall the IRS goes back to you and says, like, this number is wrong. And you're like, okay. But under the new law, whenever there is a math or clerical error or something on your part, the notice actually has to tell you all the specifics, explain what the error was, explain what the recalculation is supposed to be, and include an IRS service number so you can reach out and say, like, hey, what's up with this? It also is supposed to give much, much, much clearer language around, like, in order to appeal this, here's how you do it, and here's the timeline, which you think would be obvious, but apparently was not so much before, because previously they were just like, blah, 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 mumble, mumble, IRS, and then suddenly you just say, oh, like thousands more dollars, nobody explained to you why. And I think this kind of continues down the path of where the IRS is actually a phenomenal entry point for building trust and transparency with the American people. It's also one that can fully break it whenever we see that when it's not well staffed enough or have good enough customer experience. But this is one of those things that, like, is obvious and it happens in most other, like, modern countries that have good governments, and the US is just slowly catching up. Rada.
I will stay on the nerd train too. So I was particularly interested in this recent EU antitrust investigation into Meta, as you know, everyone is in holiday cocktail parties. So what's going on? Meta had changed WhatsApp's business. So Meta owns WhatsApp, the messaging app, and they changed their policy for APIs, which is like how different types of digital things can talk to each other, to ban general purpose AI chatbots. So the idea is like OpenAI, GPT, or Perplexity can't reach the users who use WhatsApp using WhatsApp, but Meta's own AI chatbot, the organic sort of chat in that, does work. And so the EU is arguing that this may be antitrust because it is abusing Meta's dominant position in messaging to crowd out competitors in like a different vertical, which is these AI chatbots. So it's interesting because it's actually this very concrete effort by Meta to control the AI ecosystem, and is very consistent with this general fear that dominant tech platforms are going to leverage their controls over user access for other things like search or messaging to lock in their own AI systems, and sort of creates this fear that early winners are going to dominate the market. I'll note that the EU launched this probe despite some explicit pressure from the Trump administration that warned that the U.S. would increase tariffs on steel and aluminum if the EU keeps this relatively hardline digital regulation approach that's focused on big tech companies. The EU has this pretty strict EU AI Act that is ostensibly intended to kind of restrict the market and be really clear on what is and isn't allowed in terms of safety, and at the same time is having this sort of antitrust push. So it's a lot of, I would say, general market uncertainty in the European market. Now, I won't belabor this too much, just to say three things, which is, one, it's interesting because there's clearly lessons from the social media era, and the EU doesn't want to wait to see who the winners are. But two, there's also this, like, this isn't going to solve the actual competitiveness problem that EU has. So I was looking up some numbers. 6% of global AI funding reaches European firms versus well over 60% in US firms. And of course, the US has a bunch of advantages in terms of compute and cloud infrastructure. And so the EU is doing all this restrictive stuff, but actually there's this big competitive market it's trying to go after that it's not clear any of these regulatory levers are going to let them get after. So it's a fascinating watch for those interested in the sort of policy and technology landscape.
All right, Erin, last but not least.
Indeed. So listeners to this podcast may have heard that the national security strategy was released last week. Just sort of like dropped on a website on a Thursday evening, which is definitely how you do major policy rollouts. I will admit that generally I care a lot less about the national security strategy than I do about the national defense strategy, to the extent that either of them are really binding or dispositive. I think I definitely tend to be more of the, show me your budget and I'll tell you your strategy sort of thing. That said, the document is, fairly interesting in and of itself. As I think most people were expecting, it very much highlights the Western Hemisphere vis-a-vis all other regions, calling for a sort of new Monroe Doctrine and talking about the ways in which the U.S. will prioritize activities in the Western Hemisphere. I think they sort of punt on China-related topics, although there is some reasonably strong language, or at least affirming language on Taiwan. But where most of the commentary has been around over the weekend is the language on Europe, which really is pretty dramatic for any U.S. official communication, talking about sort of a risk of civilizational collapse in Europe if they continue with their migration and other policies, criticizing them for being governed by, quote, minority governments, and, kind of a litany of essentially MAGA grievances against Western European allies, NATO partners, etc. There's probably two things, I guess, that I'll keep an eye on here. One is, really what European response to this is, other than, does it push people further down a line of sort of, eschewing, U.S. partnership or U.S. weapons and some other sorts of things? Or do the Europeans just sort of, have they already like priced this in, basically? And two is, as we've talked about before, it's not like there's an actual like National Security Council that's actually coordinating policy in any way. So like, do the priorities stated here, do the emphases stated here actually get translated into policy in a coordinated or meaningful way? The signs sort of point to no. But I guess, to the extent that there's any trade-offs or balancing suggested in this strategy, you would have to look to the National Security Council to do that. And I think that we'll kind of wait and see. So, I probably the third thing I'll keep an eye out is when the NDS actually comes out, because it seems like there's been a fair amount of Sturm and Drang around exactly how much of Bridge Colby's fingerprints are on that versus anybody else's. And I look forward to try to reading those tea leaves when it comes out.
I teach next semester the National Security Policy course at Georgetown, and had just honestly, like, full stop, been hoping that the NSS wouldn't drop until like midway through the semester, because it's just that starting off the semester, I'd be like, hey, let's talk about what national security strategy is. And here's the latest example. It helps when you have like one that kind of makes sense. It's like, here's why we do this. And this one, like, well, we have norms, and sometimes those norms get broken, and here's what that looks like. Since the NDS did not drop at Reagan National Defense Forum, and therefore there was not a further dumpster fire to this regard, we are instead going to jump into a couple other dumpster fires, which are big, kind of crazy issues that have longer-term implications for national security institutions. The first one we're going to start with has got a lot of layers to this. So we'll start off with the kind of like precipitating event, which was a couple weeks ago, as of the date we're recording. 2 National Guard soldiers from West Virginia were shot in downtown DC, nearby the White House, killing one and critically injuring another. And the suspect who was captured for this is a man's name, Ramanullah Lakwanal, an Afghan man who was evacuated after the fall of Kabul, who had worked very closely alongside U.S. forces, and as best we understand, was in an elite CIA-backed Afghan paramilitary unit that reportedly carried out a number of counterterrorism operations and night raid operations, very much at the direction of U.S. forces there. He allegedly opened fire on 2 members of the West Virginia National Guard who were on patrol. And while there's a whole lot that we don't know about him, including his motives and his connections, we know that he came to the U.S. in 2021. We know that at a superficial level, his move here was kind of a success story. He was a close partner of the U.S. He resettled his family in Washington State. He got some of the initial supports that we know that many families who came at that point in time did. I mean, we only have glimpses into his life since that time, but those include things like job instability and risk of eviction and mental health struggles that we'll get into a bit more. So we wanted to use this conversation both to kind of step back and talk about the overall program that was used to resettle or help support Afghans who worked with the United States or who were in danger in Afghanistan to the U.S. Not only after the fall of Kabul, but before that as well. How that program worked, whether it was some gaps in we saw within that, and then kind of drilling back into the events a couple of weeks ago, how that is impacting the safety and well-being of Afghans who are in the country now. So I'll start just by noting that the United States brought out about 80,000 Afghans in a huge airlift in late summer, early fall 2021, which is it was an astonishing, crazy, mind-blowing feat. And more than 200,000 have come through in different pathways beyond that, whether that be through SIV, which we'll talk about, humanitarian parole, family unification, and other things. And it wasn't just a refugee wave. A lot were interpreters or folks who had worked with U.S. forces or U.S. personnel, intelligence, and otherwise, who had very much risked their lives to protect the American people. And I want to just kind of harken back to that September 2021 moment, which was just chaotic, intense, and really, really stressful for a whole lot of folks. And kind of talk about like the scale of it, the urgency, and who the U.S. actually brought out in that time period. So I'll probably start with Radha, who was probably more heavily invested and involved in that than she wanted to be, but very much engaged in that space.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times when we think about those kind of end of the Afghan war, we think about the chaos, especially the chaos at Kabul airport and the drama there, and as well as the attacks that occurred there. But and I don't want to minimize those at all, any of that. But at the same time, the U.S., as you said, Lauren, did this amazing sort of largest non-combatant evacuation in history, just huge outflow of a number of folks that come from really varied backgrounds. So we're talking, over 120,000 that are airlifted in that August timeframe, airlifted to a number of lily pad locations across Europe and the Middle East, where they then went through vetting and onward to the U.S. In parallel, what's happening is, of course, the Taliban had advanced throughout Afghanistan with just a really rapid collapse of the government over, days and weeks. And that resulted in this chaos at the last minute. So I think, on the one hand, we have these huge long-term American presence there that was, over 2 decades. And on the other hand, you have this complex environment of the Taliban kind of resurging to power, a number of groups that align themselves with the Taliban and with the U.S. kind of figuring out their relative roles, in this huge population that had been working with the U.S. Feeling very much under risk. And that's, I think, where we had this big outflow of individuals who were seen as kind of key partners to the U.S. and enabled to fly outward. And that really was an expansion or an extension of a longstanding program that had existed, aimed at enabling those that had partnered with the U.S. to come to the U.S. And that program itself had faced a lot of limits and hadn't that SIV program that you referred to had faced a lot of issues and hadn't really had the sort of support and flow that had happened before, and so was put under additional pressure with this large volume of people coming out all at the same time.
So let's talk about that in terms of the program that as it had been set up, and then how it was put under stress at that moment. As you mentioned, like that longstanding SIV program had a lot of multi-layered security checks that were already in place, that were on top of the investigations or other kinds of security checks would have gone on for those who were working with U.S. forces or U.S. personnel at the time. So I want to I just want to recognize up front, like there is no perfect ironclad vetting system that is going to make sure that everything is perfect for anyone who is coming to the United States. But can you give a picture of what vetting for Afghan partners actually looked like in practice and how it was sort of seen as compared to other resettlement programs that might be at least somewhat comparable?
Sure. So I think that, as you said, Lauren, there really were these multi-layered checks sort of already put into place. As Rada noted, this particular program on the special immigrant visas goes back to, I think, 2006. From my perspective, it was always interesting that there was sort of an underlying tension between, on the one hand, congressional sponsors wanting there to be better funding and better resourcing to help folks leave Iraq and Afghanistan who had worked with us and to keep them safe. And secondly, though, the need for those folks to stay in country and basically rebuild both the communities and the institutions that were really important to the future of both Iraq and Afghanistan. The SIV program was relatively slow by design, especially from in the early days, which would have been really the height of the Iraq War, and it was really designed around the Iraq War as much as anything else. But there were biometrics and interviews. The security reviews were generally considered pretty rigorous. Again, at this point, really trying to make sure that they don't have ties to radical Islamic groups. Primarily Al Qaeda, but any number of other kind of violent extremist groups that you would find in these countries. As you fast forward to 2021, and as Rada described some of the chaos at the Kabul airport, part of that chaos was the incredibly rapid collapse of the Afghan government. Right, so instead of having 6 months or 12 months, which was sort of the CIA estimate for the longevity of that government, the government essentially collapses within 2-ish months of the advance of the Taliban out of the south. And so by the beginning of August, not only is the government collapsed, but it's fled. It's left the country. So that really shifts the timeline for sort of a phased withdrawal. Now, historically, that's not uncommon, right? These things, you don't really get a long goodbye in a very effective way. They have a way of rapidly culminating. But the immigrant visa program itself did have, as part of it, a number of these checks. I would say like a very best effort to determine that folks who were coming in. And again, because so many of these folks were working very closely with the U.S. military, especially in the intelligence and special operations forces, I think people were a bit inclined to assume, or at least they had the presumption that they were in fact not Taliban associates, not Al Qaeda affiliates, but instead were largely on side.
So with that, if thinking back to that time period in 2021, there was both from the U.S. government level a lot of very rapid and not always perfect, but pretty rapid support processes that were put into place. But also in civil society, amongst veterans groups and otherwise, a lot of work was done in order to create support, financial supports, relationships, other sorts of things that would help with facilitate resettlement, particularly given the numbers that we were talking about at that point in time, which was pretty significant as an all-at-once sort of thing. But thinking back to that, I think that between the three of us, we were all engaged in like sort of different individual sort of welcoming processes. And there's also a whole lot of networks that went on across the country. But there was a lot of, I guess I would say, mythology about the how that went, because it wasn't the same story for everyone, and to some degree it was quite dependent on where you were and how you happened to just kind of land in the process here. So I want to get recognizing that there's not one story about individuals and their families as they came into the United States from Afghanistan, and many cases had been overseas on bases for a while. What do we know about that, how that went? Like, what sort of immediate support did families get? Was there at least some consistency throughout? And is there a kind of standard family experience that might have happened for Afghans as they came into the country?
So I don't know if it's fair to say there is there was a standard experience. I think, there was, I would say, if we think we took out about 120, let's say around 70,000 of those moved through US bases for various periods of time when they came in that initial influx. So I think it's helpful to think about this in a time phase way with a bunch of folks who came in before August, not a lot, but certainly, over the course of this 20-year war, a non-zero number. Then a huge number of Afghans evacuated and their families evacuated in August at a variety of lily pad locations, as mentioned, in Europe and the Middle East, that kind of had a steady flow from those into the US after they completed initial vetting. Then those folks came from that on to, in many cases, though not all cases, onto bases. So I think more than half flow through that August group and onto bases, and those base experiences then vary some. But I think that's where you really start diverging. Some people go immediately into communities, some come through bases and then go to communities, some get through larger and more standardized refugee type support programs that a number of organizations, churches, and civil society groups have set up, but not everyone does. And because the numbers are large and there are hugely varying needs, with some people coming with their families, some people not, and trying to get their families to come later, some families all coming together that have, jobs and education and are just looking for employment, some that don't necessarily have the language or other skills in the US. I think you end up with a lot of variation, especially after the initial tranche of coming in. The base times were limited. There was some modest initial cash assistance and medical support, but that's not long term. And of course, then these families need to settle in communities. They need to integrate into schools and work and social life. And that is not easy. And they're not all in one place to kind of settle as a large community and group.
Yeah. I mean, there's a big distinction between coming into a community that has had an Afghan population for a long period of time, maybe has networks and others there, versus going into places that have very few refugees, period. Never mind any from the region that you're from. And that, like, you talk about like that initial support as against that longer integration. And this is one of those things which is challenging in any context, but it was particularly challenging as we're talking about those who are leaving a country that had been in civil war for decades. And many of folks were arriving with particular kinds of trauma. Many folks were arriving with professional backgrounds that are not easily translatable to another country, where even if they had been professionals in their country of origin, from the United States, doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to be a prosecutor or a pilot or otherwise. And so there's that initial period of like getting support, but then like that longer scale of what that looks like for you it's just not it's going to vary considerably based on people's individual circumstances. We don't have a perfect system in the United States in this space, and I don't know that any country does. But I wanted, in particularly in this case, since it was such I would say an emotional and really intense event for the U.S. in this context, but also for us and our community. Where did the system fall short? And both in the immediate sense, which we've kind of talked a little bit, but also in the long tail of how our refugee and asylum programs don't necessarily work in the context that we're talking about here.
Well, I think one way that I've been thinking about this, Lauren, especially in the context of the shooting a couple of weeks ago, is, I mean, this system falls short in many of the ways that our veterans care systems fall short, right? In many of the ways that our, that our other social safety nets fall short, right? So, in my head, this wave, this evacuation, this wave of refugees is most similar to Vietnam and certainly the fall of Saigon, and that's like the canonical image. The refugees that came with that were largely associated with Catholic churches, and they were supported by local parishes all across the country. My home state in Kansas has a surprising Vietnamese population, but it's tied 100% to various churches that sponsored families to come over.
Mhm.
So you don't have that community tie in the same way. Individual churches certainly participated. Catholic Relief Services certainly participated, but it lacked that cultural organizing touchstone that we would have had in the 70s and early 80s. But I really think about this in terms of the kinds of reintegration and transition challenges that the veterans community has more broadly, both in terms of trauma, also in terms of skill set, also in terms of, the civilian world is just going to be way different and maybe less interesting than this fight or flight, experience that you've had that's given your life meaning for, the previous 10 or 15 or 20 years.
That's such a great point.
It's so funny because you think about it in the veterans. I think about it as like just an extension of the way we did the whole war in Afghanistan. I remember someone once being like, it's just this, at that time, I think decade-long war, then 2-decade-long war that we fought like 1 year at a time. Like, and just like, and it was like, this is like a, 10-year reintegration project that we just like did for 6 months. And then we're like, okay, done.
But it's also like if we had
like-
better access to healthcare, right, in general,
Mhm.
Right.
as opposed to, I think a lot of people in these communities were concerned that if they attempted to access medical care, that would be like count against them. They'd be like a ward of the state. That would be a negative mark in their immigration processes. If we had places that had better public transit, then you wouldn't
Right.
like need to have a car in order to have, be able to get to a job and to do work and, these sorts of things. So there are just some, elements of kind of how much of modern American society is organized that make it particularly challenging.
Oh,
to observe
totally.
this. But you're totally right, Rada.
It's
I
just
mean,
like,
we definitely
but
were
it's
like,
like so foreseeable, right?
Yeah.
And if you just looked out into the future, you could plan for it, but that would require you to think of a future where you weren't instantaneously successful on this complex thing that you've never really been successful at before, weren't successful at for 20 years in their country, and now are here. It's just like, I mean, I don't know. I obviously clearly am jaded and cynical about this whole experience, but it just seems like we brought, a really complex experienced set of people here, and then we're surprised when we gave them no support and wasn't super great experience for them.
Yeah. And now, to be fair, I mean, I don't want to, I know you're not doing this, Rada, but I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush because there's a number of families who've come over and managed to
Yes.
get right. Like they had either this community supports or family or professional network or otherwise, and it worked out for them. So like, this is not a universal picture, but when the system failed people, that failed hard because there was not, after that first year, you then had to brave the bad overall social support system the United States has for everybody, where as Erin says, the bad public transit, a social worker whose caseworkers are totally overwhelmed, a mental health system that doesn't have nearly enough experts or beds or placements for people, particularly for those who are going to be reticent to seek support to begin with. So with all of that, we are in a moment where like we are compounding upon challenges, but it's also ones that, as you say, Rada, were entirely predictable in the same way. So catching up to where we are now, or close to where we are now, since that point in 2021, it's not as though suddenly, like after like that initial months of support, that engagements or requirements go away. Like people still need green cards or asylum processing, or may continue to need various forms of financial, health, or other kinds of support. And like we then go into the Trump administration that started having a very, very different tenor to how it talked about folks from Afghanistan, period.
Yeah, I think that we see this, as I was saying, kind of in the national security strategy, but in the, kind of carrying the tune from the first Trump administration with regard to immigration. We haven't, I think, fully relooked at a Muslim ban, but they've definitely like worked through pieces, of that. They would like to restrict immigration by country. Afghanistan has always been on that list. And certainly since the shooting, there's been, pretty dramatic rhetoric from the president, both in public. I actually can't recall if there's been specific executive orders. Lauren, you may know. But basically directing that, a halt to all the, proceedings, essentially.
So as of our recording, like there's been some policy changes that they have announced in terms of pausing asylum cases and freezing the asylum adjudications, and also just pausing the overall Afghanistan immigration process full stop. In addition to that, there's just like a lot more rhetoric coming out, and that gets translated as policy that is frankly very anti non-whites, non-European immigrants in any way, shape, or form. And like that's get translated down in mysterious ways that we don't always have like a good policy trail on.
I think it's important, and maybe this will come out. I mean, maybe it will come out that this individual was radicalized in a way that would have been familiar to us in 2012 or 2015, and that he had come to have, much more like radical Islamic or anti-American views. I think it's equally likely that he had sort of a mental health crisis.
Yep.
And like many Americans, found his way to firearms and, targets. And, it's not clear to me that like his life and work in Afghanistan is like the most relevant, characteristic that contributes to the shooting. We just simply don't know.
Yeah.
But we're going to rush to the conclusion that it was, and therefore we should, restrict, immigration from Afghanistan and potentially deport, I think, a lot of people, which would be the desire of at least some folks in the administration.
And I'll just note it's particularly telling that when you have other such shootings that involve people of different races, mostly white people and people of different viewpoints, that this is not the reaction. It's not that there's major restrictions placed on, white men who, right. So I think there is clearly a capacity to understand the mental health aspect and dangers of these firearms, but that does not seem to be breaking through in this conversation.
Yeah. And so as a final question, I just want to hear y'all's thoughts on what message this is sending to, in particular, to current partners or potential future partners, as well as to Afghans in the United States. I think that, well, I'll ask that and then I offer a closing point.
Well, yeah, it's not good. I mean, it's also not been good for like a long time. So I think, the behavior of local populations under extreme violence is much more complex and nuanced than I think most Americans typically understand. So folks will continue to work for us in future conflicts because it's their least worst option. And we will continue to struggle to do right by them afterwards, would be my guess.
And I will just say, I totally agree with all of that. The one silver lining is probably too strong, but the one adjacent to silver lining is there are a lot of people who are saying exactly what we're saying here, which is there are a tremendous number of Afghans who came who have either, the system has worked for them, or even when it hasn't, have made and continue to make a positive impact and served honorably with the US. And it is horrific to see this kind of treatment. And I think the more honest people can really say that, the better chance we have of actually signaling how much we appreciate what they did and how much we appreciate the work of partners. And that's not nothing. Even if that rhetoric isn't coming from the current, but not forever, officials in the United States government, it should still come from people outside.
Yeah. Just as a closing point, like we use the terrible shooting of the West Virginia National Guardsmen as an entry point for this. And it's obviously like there's so many stories that you could take away from that day. You could take away why were the North National Guardsmen in DC, a simplistic story of potential radicalization or why the individual in question was there, had access to firearms. You also have like this really complex, sometimes very positive, but also often very not great story that we have about how we supported our allies who came over to the United States and how we did so initially in really remarkable ways and have since then had some very predictable inconsistencies and gaps in terms of how we offer that support. So to Rada's point, I think that it gives us a moment to be able to make sure that we continue to send the right messages there, but also to question whether or not we are able to change our approach. We have another upper of a topic to turn to. A topic that we had actually addressed before, but we didn't know the full story on in terms of strikes that are going on by Southcom and SOCOM in the Caribbean. We have since learned quite a bit more, though not nearly enough, about some of the strikes that took place and whether or not they took place under the auspices of unlawful orders. So, Aaron, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through this.
Okay, so if we had been at cocktail parties this week, this would have been the other topic of conversation. I'm quite sure, which was kind of a bombshell, no pun intended, report from the Washington Post that one of the very first strikes that the Department of Defense / War conducted in the Caribbean earlier this fall actually had sort of a set of follow-up activities. And so the Washington Post reported that there was an initial strike against a boat carrying drugs. There were 2 survivors of that strike, and there was then further missile attack against those survivors. The initial Post report said that there had been an order, actually, to, quote, kill them all and to leave no survivors. That has since been heavily disputed. But there have been more recently than this week, a fair amount of testimony and closed door hearings, on this exact topic. So stepping back just a little bit, there have now been over 20 strikes against vessels in the Caribbean, mostly off the coast of Venezuela, but some a little bit further north, which have now killed over 80 people. And again, that's really since the beginning of September of this year. This week, Admiral Bradley, who's the SOCOM commander, and here I get to remind people that SOCOM and Southcom are 2 different things, something that very young Aaron did not know and got confused by on the regular. But Admiral Bradley of SOCOM and General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, briefed the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I think also House members as well, where they showed video of these strikes. Including allowing them to see essentially what happened in the aftermath of the first missile strike. So maybe either of you are welcome to jump in here on sort of the details of this so-called double tap strike. What did we learn from basically the briefings after that hearing or after that discussion on Capitol Hill this week?
Let's start with facts. We learned that there were 2 survivors on a boat and that they were clinging to the capsized, no longer functional remnants of the boat that had been hit. And that a second strike was deployed on the remaining survivors, and that they did not have any radios, I believe, to call anyone else. So those, at least as a statement of facts, are the facts that were presented.
Indeed. And with that, I think, and we'll get to this in later conversation, is an important thing about all of this in that we have very clear video and lots of track record about what actually happens, allowing U.S. senators, at least, to be able to see, if not in real time, then as though in reality, here's exactly how this went down.
And I think that there was at least some discussion. There's a 41-minute period of deliberation between the first and second missile strikes while they debate what is the proper or desired course of action. So on social media, there's been a lot of discussion around, oars to combat. A phrase I've seen more in the last 3 days than I have, I think, in the last 13 years. But a lot of discussion about the legality of striking shipwreck survivors. It seems like in some ways quite a tempest in a teapot. On the other hand, it seems shockingly relevant to this conversation. So what has that whole kind of drama been about?
Can I just say that one of my both favorite and least favorite things about the internet is how when current events emerge, the number of people who suddenly become expert and opining on very particular, esoteric areas of law. It's just fascinating to me. It really, really blossoms into a full-fledged, full-throated discussion. But maybe I'll just start by saying, having gone through the period of time when we did lots of strikes on enemy combatants through things like the authorized use of military force, which had its own, even then, acting debates of the tenuous legality and what was allowed and wasn't allowed and what those strikes entailed. The blasé way in which we have declared people our enemy, declared we're in some kind of war or armed conflict, declared that they're enemy combatants, asserted there are lists of people, and then asserted the right to kill those people without any evidence of continuing or imminent or otherwise like associated threats, and then are now applying like it can only be a law of armed conflict if you've gone through all of that stuff and now you're violating the laws. Otherwise, you're just killing people. Like it's not a conflict. You're just So I don't know. I'm like, maybe it's overly simplistic, but it just seems like you got to have all those lawyers meetings if you want to then debate law of armed conflict. Otherwise, you're just killing people.
Unfortunately, we fired all the lawyers, so I don't think that those lawyers meetings are necessarily happening.
Yeah, you raised a lot of barracks lawyers.
I want somebody to answer the pedantic point on the shipwrecked people for me first.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of barracks lawyers on this social medias, but so I think that the big key point here is that shipwrecked, wounded, or otherwise defenseless individuals are considered hors de combat. Which, like, what accent do you think people pronounce that in? I just want to think about that for a second. Meaning they cannot be lawfully targeted, full stop, period, once they are no longer a threat. And I believe it is relevant to mention, like, hanging on the side of a capsized boat likely means no longer a threat. But you know how we know it means no longer a threat is because the manual that DoD uses to teach people about this actually uses that exact example as a like, and here's where you don't go kill people.
The literal example that literally you cannot kill like the wounded or the shipwrecked.
But then we get into a very important point to Rada's point of like, you don't actually get to call it law of armed conflict when there's not a war, in that it does not actually appear that they have gone through even like the basic motions of this being defined as, organized as, worked on as a conflict, a war. And therefore, all the things that we might want to talk about in terms of like the law of armed conflict don't actually apply. And it's actually just domestic law, which has a higher bar. And then you get to think about like all kinds of other stuff you might consider for law enforcement interdiction. But full stop, it would, to my view, this is just a lot of euphemisms at the end of the day that we use to cover up the fact that this is just murder, like super expensive, very, very videoed, very approved by senior officials murder that took place in the Caribbean, which is kind of crazy because I thought the whole point of us having a military that like was supposed to like only follow lawful orders is that this shit didn't happen.
Yeah, so let's talk about lawful orders. That would be the other thing that people become an expert in on the internet over the last few weeks. So as I said, the initial story from the Washington Post indicated that Secretary Hegseth had given an order to kill all passengers on this boat. We should, I guess, also know, following Lauren's point, that drug trafficking is not a capital offense in the United States and usually requires a trial to ascertain guilt of some sort or other. But I digress. Admiral Bradley has since disputed that there was an order. I believe he told members in Capitol Hill that explicitly that there was not an order to kill the survivors. The White House and Secretary Hegseth have since essentially thrown Admiral Bradley under the bus and said that he gave the order for the second strike and that it was, the decision was up to him and it was the correct decision, but it was definitely his decision. All of which raises a question about what is supposed to happen when there is a quote unquote illegal order. We hear lots about this, frankly, in both the first Trump administration and there was, again, we talked about in our last episode, members of Congress calling on service members to remember their oaths and to not follow illegal orders. What should have happened in that maybe 40-minute deliberative session where they were trying to figure out what to do next?
So at the risk of being the exact thing I just made fun of in the previous question, in preparing for this, I was looking up the UCMJ to understand like what's the deal? Like what is the actual language and issues here? So there are a couple of pieces. There is a duty to disobey unlawful orders, and there are a list of things that can make things unlawful, including contrary to the Constitution, in violation of a set of agreed upon laws and conventions, beyond the issuing official's authority. So it's not and orders to commit crime that are patently illegal, like torture or murder. So there's like this kind of, what is it actually asking you to do? You have a duty to disobey. And then there's this, it has to be manifestly unlawful, which means that it must be clear and obvious to persons of ordinary sense and understanding that it is not lawful. So I feel like if you are trained on illegal orders with the exact example of the thing that you are being asked to do, it does feel like there is a logical thread. Not a lawyer, so that would connect these. But that, I think, is that it has to both have illegal content in it, and then it must be manifestly obvious to the people that are being ordered that that illegal content is present. And it's the connection of the two that creates an unlawful order. And then you have a duty.
Excellent internet research.
I mean, the UCMJ, it's available for everyone.
That's right.
Good answer. The thing about this that I don't want to say is complex and use that as a way to like excuse anyone, but just know that it is complex because different circumstances call for different kinds of things. And I say this to note that like what Radha's assertion there requires is space to be able to say, hey, this is illegal. And I mean like literal space, like that there is a moment in which that is a possible intervention to make. But then also, to some degree, cultural, environmental space and like to the ability to pause momentum and also go against command pressure in order to say like, hey, no, this is illegal. And we actually, I think in a lot of cases, the U.S. military works really hard to create that sort of space. Not in all cases, but like has a lot of process and expectation around like this being a question that you can raise, these being appropriate things to be able to do so, and that if people might be frustrated at the time, but like that's an appropriate thing to do. In other cases, like that's just really hard to be able to do. But we've talked, as Aaron said, about this like this really long 40+ minute pause here, where clearly there was some sort of debate or discussion of some kind going on, and I'm deeply curious about exactly what that was. Because to me, if you don't have, particularly in a 40-minute space like that, but really in any moment, if you don't have the space to say, hey, I at least have a question, or this appears to be based on that one law of war manual that I read, illegal on its face, then the system doesn't work. Like it's like we can't just say like we expect people to not follow illegal orders and then not create an opportunity for them to do so. If they don't feel like they had that, or if they had that and it was objected to, then we need to call that out. And like this needs to be like a pretty significant crisis in terms of how we think about the military's monopoly on monopoly on force.
I think it's also an opportunity where that is often, at least let's say in the movies, where you would ask for a written order, right?
Yeah.
You would request not just authorization, but like explicit direction to do so. And I think I hope that there's some further investigation as to whether there was a paper trail or the deliberate avoidance of a paper trail as part of that process. That brings us just to the last question, here, which, I think we've really highlighted not just the specific illegalities of this double tap strike, but it's in the context of a much broader kind of unlawful or unclear set of activities in the Caribbean in terms of these strikes, right? We don't have, domestic law really authorizing it. It's certainly not part of any international authorization. It's not being done in accordance with domestic law enforcement norms or even traditional Coast Guard interdiction norms. And as I said, over 80 people have already been killed. So going forward, do we think that there's room for any sort of accountability here, either for individuals or institutional? Is there something that that Congress or other actors might do, either in the near term or the short term? Or is this going to be, like a thing that happened that one time and we all sort of move on from it?
I think one thing to note at the top, okay, the answer is like in concept, yes, there's a number of things that could happen. All of them require some amount of pressure and political cover to do. Not all the same kind of level of pressure and political cover, but I don't know, particularly in the context of Congress, which we can talk about in a second, I don't know that it's there now. Like, even though we're seeing members of Congress raise questions about this, even though we're seeing like a fair amount of public pressure on this, what we're not seeing is individual members being pressured by their constituents, which is very different than lots of letters being written or people going on the news and other things like that. Those are different kinds of pressure, and it's really that the pressure by constituents that gets momentum. It's not the elite pressures in this kind of case that does. But I think like just some of the examples are, you absolutely could see some UCMJ or other or related sort of charges against individuals. But that takes just a ton of institutional buy-in to actually get started. And the people that we're talking about in question are the senior most officials that are there, like that, unless there's like some other story that we don't know about. I think Congress has had the opportunity in the last couple of days to say, we're not going to like move forward the NDAA, or we're going to pursue.
They just released the bill text.
What's that?
I mean, they just released the NDAA bill text.
Yep.
Like they could hold it up, but they're clear, they want to get it through. It's like,
yeah. So like they could have done that. Like there's a lot of things that they could do. They could have they could pause on some of the confirmation hearings they want to do. They haven't done any of those, and those they're kind of no harm, no foul things. Like they could do that for a couple of days and get the thing that they want and then keep going. Like there's not going to be somebody who's substantially injured by them like delaying that stuff. But, and then like, I mean, IG investigations and GAO, but like that gets further into yeah, that's nice that we have the record, but it doesn't actually do anything.
I mean, I think even stepping back from this particular thing, which is egregious in its own way, I think this is just another, like there is a full ceding of core Article 1 powers from Congress, which is congressional, to the president. And I note Article 3 powers from the courts to the president too. But, the power to tax, which we've seen through the tariffs, has been largely ceded now to the president. The power to declare war had been eroding for some time under a range of Article 2 over several presidents, not unique to Trump, but is fully here now. There's not even an attempt for this, for armed conflict. And so I think, will there be accountability? Maybe. That seems like it's going to have to necessitate executive branch action at this point. And I don't see either of the quote unquote co-equal branches really asserting their inherent authorities to do that. And I don't know why this would be different than any of the others. That wasn't optimistic. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't think we have. I mean, I'm not going to pose our final question here. I'll just state it kind of as the kicker, which is that this is all occurring in the context of a broader military buildup in the Caribbean and the potential for some kind of strikes or even, I guess, a ground invasion of Venezuela itself. And so this could be sort of the tip of the iceberg. And I don't think that we're going to have substantially better legal proceedings or authorization for that, though I suppose we will see.
All right. For our Gong show this week, we're going to keep on a holiday theme. And note up front, before we move on to our question, if you've not given us a rating on your listening platform of choice, please do so. And or if you have already done that, share our podcast with a friend who you think might love us and who wouldn't. So make sure to share it with everybody. So our question this episode, again, building on our holiday theme, is as I say Christmas, but what holiday movie would you pitch to Hallmark or Netflix, depending on your vibe, if you got the chance to do so? And I will start with mine because this came up at a conference that I was in last week. We had some people who had thought about this in far more detail than I ever had before. And I was a little embarrassed by this, both embarrassed that I had not, because I care deeply about Hallmark Netflix movies. So mine is, why on earth has there not been a movie about NORAD tracking Santa, wherein Santa, it becomes clear to NORAD that Santa is real. And you have a few things clearly going on in this movie. One is a crusty colonel who falls deeply in love with a mom who is trying to prove to her kid that Santa is real. While at the same time, you have a creepy major who believes that Santa is a national security threat and is trying to shoot him down in some way. And then there's all kinds of hijinks that happen. But why has that movie been made? I just don't understand.
I wish people could see how into this Rada is and how not into this I am.
So into it. I have thought about this a lot because I had this general idea of rom-com set more in the DC bureaucracy space. So I just want you to know, I feel like for all the writers out there, there is a rich genre here. But my holiday version of this is she's a Pentagon staffer working on key pick your region, hot region of choice, Southcom. He's an NSC director micromanaging the Department of Defense. All of a sudden, there is a just before the holidays crisis that necessitates a series of meetings. And it turns out they're from the same small town and are trying to get this resolved in time to go home for Christmas. What could happen, folks? What could happen?
Rada, have you seen Operation Christmas Drop?
I sure have.
Okay, I'm just making sure. Or
Don't worry.
Let's haven't is a movie that combines the following: Guam, BRAC, and Santa Claus.
And
like,
congressional
real plot.
staffers really asking pointed questions to senior military officials in briefings in which you're like, you're not okay.
Also, and once more, a major appears to be in charge of a lot of things.
A lot of things. Majors.
Love
They get the job
majors.
done.
So I, as usual, do not have a good answer to this. I like it when we talk about books more. I do not watch Hallmark movies. I hate Hallmark movies. My mother has them on like dawn till dusk when I go home, and it's just like neat, like nails on a chalkboard for me the entire time. I do like a few of the Netflix ones, but not the princess-based ones. I mean, they're, I guess, I could be talked into some sort of Christmas heist, like a heist type situation. But really, I'd like there to be a Christmas movie about a woman who wants to sit at home and drink yummy cocktails and read her books and be left alone while her entire family has some sort of activity like in the house next door. Like that would really be a Christmas miracle. So that's sort of where I'm a killjoy when it comes to the holidays, I have to say.
Oh man, it's like I love all of the princess ones, but I think my current favorite one in like the worst possible version of all of this is a Castle for Christmas.
Oh my God,
it's the
love
best.
it. And also I want that dress that she wears at the end. I often think about this.
Yes. That one I do like. But that's like a real enemies to lovers with a Scottish accent and the Princess Bride. So like it's all good.
Everything
What's
you
not to
need.
love?
And Carrie Ellis is, let's be super clear, not Scottish.
No, not at all. I don't care.
All right. Well, I hope you're enjoying whatever your holiday movies of choice are, or holiday beverages of choice. And we will catch you next time.